Sometimes, the room doesn't laugh because you're funny. It laughs because it thinks you don't belong. The chandelier above shimmered like a constellation trapped in crystal, casting warm gold across silk gowns and tailored tuxedos, the kind of light that made everything look expensive, effortless, untouchable. And yet somehow, Emily Dawson stood right in the middle of it, feeling like the only thing that didn't fit. Her fingers lightly gripping the edge of a silver tray she wasn't even supposed to be holding anymore. Her dress simple, off the rack, the hem just slightly uneven if anyone bothered to look close enough, which they did, because people like them always noticed the wrong details, the scuffed heels, the way she hesitated half a second too long before stepping forward, the quiet way she exhaled like she was reminding herself to stay steady, to stay invisible, to just get through the night. And for a moment, it almost worked, until the laughter started, soft at first, like a ripple through champagne glasses, then sharper, louder, pointed, and suddenly all eyes were on her, not with curiosity, not with kindness, but with that familiar expression she'd learned to recognize her whole life, the polite kind of cruelty dressed up as amusement. And then came the voice, smooth, cold, perfectly measured. "Oh my God! Who let her in here?" A woman in a deep red gown tilted her head slightly, lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile, her diamond bracelet catching the light as she gestured vaguely in Emily's direction, like she wasn't even worth pointing at directly. And Emily felt it, that subtle shift in the room, the way conversations paused just long enough to watch, to judge, to confirm what they already believed, that she didn't belong, that she was a mistake in a room built on perfection, and still, she didn't move, didn't shrink, didn't run, even as her heart pressed hard against her ribs, even as heat crept up her neck. She simply set the tray down carefully on the nearest table, her movements precise, controlled, because dignity, she'd learned, was sometimes the only thing no one could take from you unless you handed it over. And she wasn't about to do that tonight. Not again. Not here. Not in front of people who had never known what it meant to count dollars before buying dinner or to choose between rent and a dream. She lifted her chin just enough, her voice quiet but steady. "I was invited." For a split second, the room hesitated, not because they believed her, but because she said it without apology, and that alone felt out of place. And then the laughter came back, sharper this time, louder, as if her words had only made the joke better. And somewhere near the entrance, unnoticed by everyone except the security guard who suddenly straightened his posture, a man stepped inside, his presence subtle but undeniable, the kind that didn't need an introduction, the kind that shifted the air before anyone even realized why. And though Emily hadn't turned yet, hadn't seen him, something in the room had already begun to change. The guard stepped forward first, his voice low but firm. "Ma'am, I am going to have to ask you to leave." And it was not loud, not aggressive, but it carried just enough authority to make nearby conversations fade again into that same watchful silence, the kind that felt heavier than noise. And Emily turned slightly, meeting his eyes, not with defiance, not with fear, but with something steadier, something that made him hesitate for half a second longer than he should have, as if he was not entirely sure she belonged outside either. But the room had already decided for him, the woman in red giving a small, satisfied nod as she lifted her champagne glass. "Yes, please do," before she embarrasses herself further. And a few people chuckled again, softer this time, like they were careful not to seem too cruel while still enjoying the moment. And Emily swallowed, her throat tight, not from shame, not entirely, but from the weight of being seen and dismissed in the same breath. She glanced toward the exit, calculating. One step and it would be over. She could leave, disappear back into the version of the world that made sense for someone like her. Small apartments, late shifts, quiet dreams that stayed safely out of rooms like this. And yet her feet did not move, because something in her refused to let this be the ending. Not tonight. Not after everything it had taken just to stand here. "I said I was invited," she repeated, softer now, but no less certain. And this time, the woman in red laughed outright, a clear, ringing sound that cut through the music. "Invited by who?" she asked, tilting her head as if genuinely curious, as if this were all just a harmless game. And for a moment, Emily did not answer, because the truth sat right there on the edge of her tongue, fragile, complicated, impossible to explain in a room that had already decided not to believe her, her mind flickering back to a week ago, to a quiet office that smelled faintly of leather and coffee, to a man who did not smile easily and did not explain. More than he had to the way he had slid a single sheet of paper across the desk and said, "This is simple. Emily, you get security, I get what I need, no emotions, no expectations." And she had stared at that paper, at the signature line, at the life it offered and the cost it did not fully explain, and she had signed anyway, because sometimes survival did not look like dignity. It looked like a choice you hoped you would understand later. And now here she was, standing in a room that felt like it belonged to him, not her, being asked to prove something that had never been meant to be public, never meant to be tested like this. The guard shifted again, more certain this time. "Ma'am, I really need you to come with me." And Emily exhaled slowly, her shoulders straightening just a fraction as she reached for the only thing she had left, the truth. "Daniel Sterling invited me," she said, and the name landed in the air like a spark that refused to catch. A few brows lifted, a couple of people exchanged glances, and then, almost immediately, the disbelief returned, sharper, colder. "That is not funny," the woman in red replied, her smile thinning. "Daniel Sterling does not invite girls like you." And just as the words settled, just as the room prepared to laugh again, a voice from behind them cut clean through the space. Calm, unmistakable, and far more dangerous in its quiet than any raised tone could ever be. "She is right." The room did not just fall silent. It stilled, like the air itself had been pulled tight, every head turning at once toward the source of that voice. And Emily felt it before she saw him, that shift in presence, the subtle gravity that drew attention without asking for it. And when she finally turned, her breath caught just slightly, not because she had not seen him before, but because he looked different here, sharper somehow, more defined against the glow of crystal and gold. Daniel Sterling stepped forward with an ease that did not need to be practiced, his tailored suit flawless, his expression calm, almost unreadable, and yet there was something in his eyes, something deliberate, as if every step he took was measured against a decision he had already made. The guard immediately straightened, stepping back without being told. "Mr. Sterling," he said quickly, and around them, whispers began to ripple, low and urgent, names and numbers and quiet speculation, because everyone in that room knew exactly who he was. The man who owned half the skyline they admired through glass windows. The man whose approval could elevate or erase reputations in a single conversation, and yet his attention was not on them. It was on her, completely, unwavering, as if the rest of the room had already disappeared, and for a second, Emily forgot the laughter, forgot the stares, forgot everything except the fact that he was here, that he had heard her, that he had chosen to speak. The woman in red recovered first, her smile returning, though tighter now, more cautious. "Daniel, I am so glad you are here. We were just dealing with a bit of confusion," she said lightly, gesturing toward Emily as if presenting a problem already solved. "She claims you invited her." And there it was again, that almost laugh waiting at the edge of her words, that certainty that this would all resolve in her favor, that the world would return to its proper order the moment he confirmed it. And Daniel did not answer right away. He let the silence stretch just enough to make everyone feel it, his gaze shifting briefly across the room, taking in the faces, the reactions, the expectation, before returning to Emily. And when he spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried, clear and undeniable. "I did," he said, and the effect was immediate, not loud, not explosive, but profound, like a glass surface cracking beneath pressure. The woman's smile faltered, just for a fraction of a second, enough to reveal the uncertainty beneath it. "Well," she began, recovering quickly, "that is unexpected, but still, I think there must be some misunderstanding about the nature of the event. It is a private." "There is no misunderstanding," Daniel interrupted gently, not raising his voice, not needing to, and he took another step forward, closing the distance between himself and Emily, close enough now that she could see the faint tension in his jaw, the way his hand flexed once at his side, as if holding something back, something he had not planned to show yet. And for a moment, their eyes met, And in that brief exchange, something unspoken passed between them, something that felt heavier than the contract she had signed, heavier than the room around them, something that asked a question neither of them had expected to answer tonight. And then he turned slightly, just enough to face the others again, his presence settling fully into the space like a final decision. And when he spoke next, there was no hesitation left in his voice at all. "She is not just invited," Daniel said, his voice steady, each word placed with intention. "She belongs here." And the sentence landed differently this time. Not like a correction, not like a polite clarification, but like a line being drawn across the entire room, something that could not be easily laughed off or dismissed. And for a moment, no one moved, no one spoke, because what he had said did not fit the version of reality they had already decided on. The woman in red blinked, her expression tightening as she searched his face for something, anything that would suggest this was a joke, a misunderstanding, a moment he would retract. "Daniel," she said again, softer now, almost cautious, "I think you might not realize what is happening here." But he did not look at her, not immediately, his attention still on Emily. And in that silence between them, something shifted again, deeper this time, because she could see it now, the conflict he had been holding back, the line he had not planned to cross tonight, and the fact that he was about to cross it anyway. Her fingers tightened slightly at her sides, the memory of that office, that paper, those clear, cold rules echoing in her mind. No emotions, no expectations, no complications, and yet nothing about this moment felt simple anymore. "Daniel," she said quietly, just enough for him to hear. Not a question, not quite a warning, but something in between, and his gaze flickered, just for a second, like he understood exactly what she meant, exactly what this would change, and then he turned fully toward the room, toward the people who had been watching, judging, laughing only seconds ago, and the shift in his posture was subtle but undeniable, the kind of authority that did not need to raise its voice to be heard. "There seems to be some confusion," he continued, his tone calm, almost conversational, but every word carried weight. "So let me make it very clear." The room leaned in without realizing it, drawn by the certainty in his voice, the absence of hesitation, the quiet confidence of someone who did not need permission to define reality. And then he stepped closer to Emily, close enough now that his presence surrounded her, not overwhelming, not possessive, but protective in a way that felt unfamiliar and dangerously real, his hand lifting slightly, pausing for the briefest moment as if giving her a choice she did not know how to answer, and then settling gently at the small of her back, grounding, undeniable. "Emily Dawson," he said, her name spoken fully, clearly, as if it belonged in this room as much as any other, "is not a guest." A breath held across the crowd, a silence so complete it felt like the entire evening had narrowed to this single moment. And then the final piece, the one that changed everything, the one that could not be taken back once. It was said, "She is my wife." And this time, there was no laughter, no polite dismissal, no easy way to smooth it over, because the words did not invite interpretation, they demanded it. The woman in red's glass stilled halfway to her lips, the faint clink of crystal against her ring the only sound breaking the stillness. Someone near the back whispered something that did not quite form into words, and the guard who had just moments ago been ready to escort Emily out now stood completely still, as if unsure where he belonged in this new version of the room. And Emily herself did not move, did not speak, because the impact of what he had just said had not fully settled yet, not in her chest, not in her mind. It hovered there, suspended between reality and something else, something far more complicated than the contract she had signed, far more dangerous than the laughter she had endured, because this was not just a claim, not just a defense. This was a line that once crossed could not be undone, and for the first time since she had stepped into that room, the silence around her did not feel like judgment, it felt like power shifting. For a long moment, no one dared to move, as if the entire room had been rewritten in a single sentence, and they were all still trying to catch up, the word wife hanging in the air heavier than the crystal chandeliers above them. And then the whispers came, not laughter this time, but something sharper, more uncertain, a quiet storm of questions spreading from table to table, because this was not a rumor, not speculation. This was Daniel Sterling saying it himself. and that made it real whether they understood it or not. The woman in red slowly lowered her glass, her fingers tightening just slightly around the stem as she forced a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "Your wife," she repeated, her tone carefully neutral now, but the disbelief beneath it impossible to hide. "That is unexpected." And Daniel finally turned his gaze toward her, not cold, not hostile, just steady. The kind of calm that did not invite argument. "It is not up for discussion," he said simply, and the finality in his voice closed the door on whatever challenge she had been preparing, her lips parting slightly before pressing together again as she nodded. Once, a small retreat masked as composure. Around them, people shifted, recalibrating, adjusting their expressions, their posture, their assumptions, because power had moved. And in rooms like this, people followed power more quickly than truth. And suddenly the same eyes that had judged Emily moments ago were looking at her differently, measuring, reconsidering, trying to reconcile the girl in the simple dress with the title that had just been placed beside her name. And Emily felt it all, every shift, every glance, every silent calculation. But none of it landed the same way anymore, because his hand was still at her back, steady, grounding, and for reasons she did not fully understand, it made it easier to stand there without shrinking, without apologizing, and yet inside, everything was anything but steady, her mind racing back to that office, to the contract she had signed with shaking hands, to the words that had been so clear then. No emotions, no expectations, no public complications, and now here they were, standing in the most public room possible, with a line crossed that could not be uncrossed. She turned her head slightly toward him, her voice low, barely above a breath. "You were not supposed to say that." And for the first time since he had entered the room, something shifted in his expression, something almost like honesty breaking through the control. "I know," he answered, just as quietly, and there was no defense in it, no attempt to justify, just acknowledgement, and that unsettled her more than anything else, because this was not part of the agreement, not part of the plan she had convinced herself she could manage. Across the room, someone approached cautiously, a man in a dark suit with a practiced smile, extending his hand toward Daniel. "Congratulations, I suppose," he said, testing the new reality, and Daniel accepted the gesture without hesitation, the conversation shifting seamlessly into something formal, something expected, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. But Emily could feel the difference, the way every introduction now carried a weight it had not before, the way her presence was no longer invisible, no longer dismissible, and yet not entirely understood either. She was being watched not because she did not belong, but because no one could quite figure out how she did. And as the room slowly resumed its rhythm, softer now, more cautious, Emily realized something had changed in a way that went beyond the whispers and the stares, something between her and the man standing beside her, because whatever this had started as, whatever rules had once defined it, this moment had broken through them, and neither of them seemed entirely certain what came next. The music resumed first, soft and polished, as if nothing had happened, as if a single sentence had not just shifted the balance of the entire room. But the conversations that followed were different now, lower, more careful, like people were choosing their words with precision instead of ease, and Emily could feel it in the way they approached, one by one, offering polite smiles, measured greetings, subtle glances that lingered just a second too long, trying to read her, to understand how someone like her had become someone they now had to acknowledge. "Mrs. Sterling," a woman said, the title sounding almost unfamiliar in her own ears, and Emily's fingers twitched slightly at her side, not correcting it, not confirming it either, just letting it exist in the space between truth and performance, because that was what this was supposed to be, a performance, a role she had agreed to play under clear, controlled conditions, and yet nothing about this felt controlled anymore. Daniel moved effortlessly beside her, responding to greetings, exchanging brief conversations, his tone steady, composed, as if this moment had always been part of his plan. But every so often, his attention returned to her, quick, almost imperceptible glances that checked, that measured, that asked without words if she was still standing, still holding together, and each time their eyes met, Emily felt that same unsettling pull, like she was standing too close to something She did not fully understand, something that could not be undone once she stepped any further into it. Smile. He murmured quietly at one point, barely turning his head, and she almost laughed at that, not because it was funny, but because it was so simple compared to everything else. So she did, just a little, just enough to soften the edges of the tension that still clung to her, and immediately, the room responded, like they had been waiting for that signal, for confirmation that she could fit into this space after all, that she could play the part they now needed her to play. But beneath that surface, beneath the practiced calm and the careful movements, her thoughts were anything but steady. They circled back again and again to the same question. Why did he do it? Why cross that line when he had been the one to draw it so clearly? Across the room, she caught sight of the woman in red again, now speaking quietly with another guest, her expression composed, but her eyes sharper. Watching, calculating, not convinced, not satisfied. And Emily knew that whatever had just happened was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of something far more complicated, something that would not stay contained within a single night or a single room. We need to talk, Emily said finally, her voice low but firm, turning slightly toward Daniel as the space around them shifted again, a new conversation beginning nearby, giving them just enough privacy to speak without being overheard. And this time, he did not deflect, did not delay, his expression tightening just slightly as if he had been expecting this moment from the second he made his choice. We will, he replied, just as quietly, but not here. And there was something in the way he said it, not avoidance, not dismissal, but a recognition that whatever this was, whatever they had just stepped into, it could not be resolved under chandeliers and watchful eyes. And for the first time since the laughter had started, Emily felt something else settle in her chest. Not fear, not embarrassment, but a quiet awareness that the night had already changed everything, and that whatever came next would not follow the rules she thought she had agreed to. The moment stretched just long enough to feel intentional before Daniel shifted slightly, guiding Emily with a subtle pressure at her back, not forceful, not controlling, but unmistakably directional, and without announcing it, without drawing attention, he led her away from the center of the room, past clusters of quiet conversations and lowered voices, toward a corridor lined with tall glass panels that reflected the golden light in softer, quieter tones, and with each step, the noise behind them faded, replaced by something calmer, something more honest, until finally the doors closed behind them with a muted click, sealing off the performance they had just maintained. And for a second, neither of them spoke, the silence now different, no longer heavy with judgment, but charged with everything left unsaid. Emily turned first, her composure slipping just enough to reveal the tension she had been holding in place all night, her arms crossing lightly as if to steady herself. You broke the rules, she said, not accusing, not emotional, just stating a fact that hung clearly between them. Daniel did not respond immediately, his gaze shifting briefly to the glass beside them where their reflections stood side by side, a pairing that still looked slightly unreal even to him, and then back to her. I know, he said again, and there was that same honesty, that same lack of defense, and somehow that made it harder, not easier, for her to process. Then why? She asked, the question sharper now, because it mattered, because this was not just a mistake she could ignore or a moment she could pretend had not happened. This changed everything. And Daniel exhaled slowly, as if choosing his words carefully, not because he did not have an answer, but because the truth was more complicated than either of them had planned for. Because they were wrong, he said finally, and Emily blinked, caught off guard by how simple that sounded compared to what she had expected. They laughed at you, he continued, his tone still calm, but something underneath it tightening, something that had not been there before. And I was not going to stand there and let that continue. And for a moment, that almost made sense, almost fit into something she could accept, but it was not enough, not for what he had done, not for the line he had crossed. You could have stopped it without saying that, she replied quietly, her voice steady but her eyes searching his, trying to understand what he was not saying, what he was choosing not to explain. And this time, he did not answer right away, his silence stretching longer, heavier, until it said more than words could have, and Emily felt it then, that shift again, deeper this time, because this was no longer about the room, or the people, or even the contract. It was about something else, something neither of them had accounted for. This was supposed to be simple, she said after a moment, softer now, almost to herself. A signature, a role, a clean arrangement. And Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, the faintest sign that her words had landed exactly where they were meant to. It was, he said, and then, quieter, more honest than before, until it was not. And that was it, the first real crack in the structure they had both agreed to. The first admission that whatever they had started with was no longer holding its shape. And Emily looked at him, really looked this time, not as the man who had offered her a contract, not as the man who controlled rooms like the one they had just left, but as someone standing in the same uncertain space she now found herself in. And for the first time since the night began, she was not sure which of them had changed more, the girl who had walked into that room, expecting to survive it, or the man who had just rewritten everything to keep her from walking out of it alone. For a few seconds, neither of them moved, the quiet hallway holding their words like it was waiting to see what they would do with them. And Emily felt the weight of his last sentence settle deeper than she expected, not because it was dramatic, not because it was loud, but because it was true in a way that made everything else uncertain. She let out a slow breath, her arms loosening slightly as she looked past him toward the glass, where the city lights stretched out in perfect lines, distant, controlled, predictable, everything their situation was not. "Do you even realize what you just did in there?" she asked, her voice calmer now, but no less serious. And Daniel followed her gaze for a moment before answering. "Yes," he said, and the certainty in his tone almost frustrated her more than anything else. "You turned something private into something everyone will talk about by morning," she continued, her eyes returning to him, sharper now, more focused. "Your board, your investors, your family, they are not going to ignore this." And Daniel nodded slightly, not dismissing it, not denying it, just accepting it as part of the consequence. "They will not," he agreed. And there it was again, that calm acceptance that made it clear he had already thought this through, already stepped past the point of hesitation she was still standing in. "Then why are you acting like that does not matter?" she pressed, taking a step closer now, not aggressive, but unwilling to let this stay vague. And for the first time, something shifted more visibly in him, not control breaking, but tightening, like he was choosing what to say carefully because it mattered more than usual. "Because it matters less than what happened to you in that room," he said, and the words landed with a quiet weight that caught her off guard. Not because they were complicated, but because they were not. They were direct, personal, and harder to deflect. Emily opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Right away, because part of her wanted to argue, to bring it back to the contract, to the rules, to the boundaries that had made this manageable, but another part of her, quieter, less practiced, recognized something else entirely, something she had not expected from him. "You were supposed to stay detached," she said finally, her voice softer now, almost careful, and Daniel let out a faint breath that might have been a quiet laugh if it had not carried so much tension with it. "That was the plan," he admitted, his eyes holding hers now without hesitation. "But plans change when reality does not match expectations." And that was it again, another step further away from the simplicity they had agreed to, another shift that made the ground beneath them feel less certain. Emily shook her head slightly, not in disbelief, but in recognition that this was no longer something she could neatly define. "This was not part of the deal," she said, and Daniel's expression softened just enough to show that he understood exactly what she meant. "No," he said quietly. "It was not." And for a moment, the silence returned. But this time it was not tense, not unresolved, it was something else. Something that felt like a pause before a decision neither of them had fully made yet. And then from beyond the glass doors, the faint sound of laughter drifted back in, reminding them that the world they had stepped out of was still there, still watching, still waiting. And Emily realized that whatever this had become, whatever line had been crossed, there was no easy way to step back into that room as if nothing had changed, because something had, something between them that no contract had prepared her for, and she was not sure if that made things more dangerous or more real. Emily stood there for a moment longer, feeling the quiet press of everything that had just been said, and then she did the only thing that still made sense to her. She stepped back, creating just enough distance to think clearly again, to breathe without the weight of his presence clouding every thought. "We cannot walk back in there like nothing happened," she said, her voice steadier now, grounded again in logic, in the part of her that had survived far more predictable struggles than this. Daniel watched her carefully, not interrupting, not redirecting, just listening, which somehow made it harder to hold on to her argument. "If we do, they will expect answers," she continued. "Real ones, not vague ones, not deflections." She glanced toward the doors, where the faint hum of the gala still lingered. "And the truth is, we do not have those." Daniel tilted his head slightly, considering her words, not dismissing them, but not agreeing either. "We have enough," he replied, and that made her look back at him immediately, because that was not the same thing, not even close. "Enough for them is not enough for me," she said, and there it was again. That line she was trying to draw, not between them, but between what was real and what was being constructed in front of everyone else. Daniel's expression shifted, not defensive, not frustrated, but more focused now, as if he understood that this was the part that mattered most to her. "Then tell me what you need," he said, simply, and the question caught her off guard, because it was not something she had expected him to ask, not in this situation, not with everything else at stake. She hesitated, just for a moment, because what she needed was not something written into any contract, not something she could define as clearly as the terms they had both agreed to. "I need to know this is still what we agreed to," she said finally, choosing her words carefully. "That this is still controlled, still temporary, still something I can walk away from when it ends." And the moment the words left her mouth, she felt it, the shift in him, subtle but real, like something tightening beneath the surface, not anger, not resistance, but something more complicated, something that did not fit neatly into either of their expectations. Daniel looked at her for a long second, and in that silence, she realized she had asked a question he could not answer the way he had answered everything else tonight. "It was supposed to be," he said at last, and that was all. No reassurance, no clear boundary, just the same uncertainty she had been trying to avoid, and that unsettled her more than anything else, because it meant the ground beneath them was no longer fixed, it was shifting, changing in ways neither of them had planned for. "That is not the same as it is," she replied quietly, and for the first time, there was something fragile in her voice, not weakness, but honesty, the kind she usually kept hidden. Daniel exhaled slowly, his gaze dropping briefly before returning to hers, and when he spoke again, his voice was lower, more measured. "Then maybe we need to redefine what this is." And that was it. The moment everything moved from arrangement to something else entirely, not yet named, not yet understood, but no longer contained. And from the other side of the doors, someone laughed again, a reminder that the world outside still expected them to return, to play their roles, to continue the story that had just been rewritten. And Emily realized that whatever choice they made next, it would not just affect how the night ended, it would decide what this became. For a moment, the hallway felt too small for the weight of what had just been said, like the space itself could not contain the shift that had taken place between them, and Emily felt it settle in her chest, that quiet realization that there was no version of this anymore that stayed simple, no clean exit that would leave everything untouched, and yet she still tried. Because that was what she had always done, find the line, define it, hold on to it no matter how everything else changed. "Redefine it how?" she asked, her voice steady again. But there was something more careful in it now, something that acknowledged the answer might not be what she wanted to hear. Daniel did not respond right away, his gaze drifting briefly back toward the doors, toward the room that still waited for them, still expected them, and then back to her. "Not here," he said quietly. And this time, there was no hesitation in his tone, no uncertainty, just a decision already made. Emily exhaled slowly, the tension in her shoulders easing just slightly as she followed his line of sight, because she understood what he meant. Whatever this conversation was, whatever this had become, it could not happen in fragments, not between interruptions and expectations. It needed space, clarity, something neither of them had allowed themselves yet. "If we leave now," she said, her eyes narrowing slightly as she thought it through, "they will notice." Daniel gave the faintest hint of a nod. "They already have," he replied, and there was a quiet truth in that. one that made her almost smile despite everything. Because he was right. Nothing about tonight had gone unnoticed. Not her arrival, not the laughter, and certainly not what he had said. Then we do not get to pretend this is normal anymore, she said, and Daniel's expression softened just slightly. Not disagreement, but recognition. It never was, he answered, and that landed differently. Not as a contradiction, but as a correction of something she had been trying to believe from the beginning. Emily looked at him for a long second, searching for something that felt solid, something she could still rely on, and then she nodded once, small but certain. Okay, she said, and that single word carried more weight than any argument she had made before, because it was not agreement, not acceptance, but a willingness to face whatever came next without pretending it would be simple. Daniel stepped back just enough to open the door, the sound of the gala returning immediately, softer than before, but no less present. And this time, when they walked back in, it felt different. Not like stepping into a room where she did not belong, but into a space that had already been altered by their absence. Conversations paused again, heads turned, but there was no laughter now, only attention, sharp and focused, as if everyone was waiting to see what they would do next. Daniel did not hesitate, his hand returning briefly to her back, not to guide this time, but to steady, to signal, and together they moved forward, not toward the center, not toward the spotlight, but through it, past it, toward the exit on the far side of the room. And as they passed, people stepped aside without being asked, making space not just for him, but for her too, and Emily felt it, that shift again, but this time it did not feel like something being given. It felt like something she had chosen to step into, uncertain, unfinished, but real in a way that could no longer be ignored. And just before they reached the doors, she glanced up at him, her voice low, almost lost beneath the music. When we walk out of here, she said, there is no going back to what this was. Daniel met her gaze without hesitation, his answer immediate, unwavering. I know. And for the first time since the night began, neither of them looked away. The doors opened with a soft push, and the night air met them instantly, cool and quiet, a sharp contrast to the controlled warmth of the ballroom they had just left behind. And for the first time since stepping into that building, Emily felt like she could breathe without being watched, without being measured. The city stretched out in front of them, lights blinking across glass towers and passing cars humming along the street below, normal, distant, untouched by whatever had just unfolded inside. She took a few steps forward, instinctively putting space between herself and the entrance, as if she needed that distance to separate what was real from what had just happened. Daniel followed without rushing, his pace steady, giving her room without losing proximity. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence no longer heavy, but necessary, like both of them were adjusting to a version of the night that no longer required performance. Emily wrapped her arms lightly around herself, not from the cold, but from the need to hold something steady, something familiar. You really meant it, she said finally, her voice quieter now, not questioning the words themselves, but the intention behind them. Daniel did not pretend to misunderstand. Yes, he answered, and there was no hesitation, no attempt to soften it into something easier. And that was what made her turn to him fully, because she had expected a version of this that could be explained away, justified as strategy, as necessity, as something that fit into the agreement they had made. But this did not feel like that. You could have corrected them, she said, searching his face for something she could define. You could have said it was temporary, that it was not what they thought. And Daniel shook his head slightly, not dismissing her, but rejecting the premise. That would have made it easier for them, he said. Not for you. And the simplicity of that answer hit her harder than anything else he had said, because it shifted the focus away from him, away from reputation and control, and placed it entirely on her, on what she had experienced in that room. And for a moment, she did not know what to do with that, because it was not something she had expected from him, not something she had prepared for. You are not responsible for that, she said, more softly now, not as a correction, but as a reminder of the boundaries that had once defined. This, Daniel's gaze held hers, steady, unwavering. Maybe not, he admitted, but I am responsible for what I choose to do when I see it. And there it was again, that quiet certainty that made it impossible to reduce this to a simple mistake or a calculated move. Emily looked away for a second, her eyes tracing the line of headlights moving through the street below, trying to find something stable in the pattern, because everything else felt like it was shifting too quickly. This changes things, she said after a moment. And this time it was not a warning, not a concern, just a fact. Daniel nodded once. I know, he replied, and the calm in his voice did not suggest denial. It suggested acceptance, as if he had already stepped into whatever came next while she was still standing at the edge of it. She turned back to him slowly, her expression no longer guarded, but thoughtful, like she was seeing him more clearly now than she had before, not just as the man who had offered her a contract, but as someone who had made a choice that went beyond it. Then we need to be clear about what this is now, she said. And Daniel took a step closer, not closing the distance entirely, but enough to show he was no longer standing apart from the question. Then let us be clear, he said quietly, and the city lights flickered behind them as if the night itself was waiting for the answer they were about to define. Emily held his gaze for a long second, feeling the weight of what he had just said settle into something real, something that could not be explained away as impulse or strategy. And for the first time since the night began, she realized she was no longer asking what had happened. She was asking what it meant, her fingers slowly uncurling at her sides as if she was letting go of the last piece of certainty she had been holding on to. Clear means no hiding, she said quietly, her voice steady but unguarded now. No pretending this is still just a contract when it is not. Daniel did not interrupt, did not soften it. He simply nodded once, accepting the terms without negotiation, and that alone told her more than any explanation could have. And it also means I need the truth, she continued, taking a small step closer, closing the distance just enough to make the moment feel direct, unavoidable. Not the version you give your board, not the version you show the world. I need to know why you really did it. And there it was, the question that had been building beneath everything else, the one that could not be answered with control or strategy, the one that required something he had not planned to give. Daniel's expression shifted slightly, not guarded, not distant, but more open than she had seen it before, like he understood that whatever he said next would define everything that came after. He exhaled slowly, his gaze dropping for just a second before returning to hers. And when he spoke, his voice was quieter, but more certain than it had been all night. Because it stopped being about the deal the moment I saw you standing there alone, he said. And the simplicity of it made her chest tighten in a way she had not expected. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, just enough to make it real. I told myself it was still controlled, he continued. That I could keep it separate, that I could keep you separate. And there was a faint shift in his tone, something closer to honesty than control now. But I was wrong. Emily blinked, not because she did not understand, but because she did. And that was what made it harder to hold on to the version of this she had been trying to keep intact. So what does that mean? She asked her. Voice softer now, not demanding, but searching, and Daniel took one more step forward, closing the space between them until there was no distance left to hide behind. It means I do not want this to be temporary, he said, and the words landed without hesitation, without uncertainty. It means I do not want you to walk away when it ends, because I do not want it to end. And for a moment, the city noise faded. The passing cars, the distant voices, everything outside that space blurring into the background as the meaning of what he had just said settled between them. Emily did not answer right away, because this was no longer about reacting, no longer about defending the structure they had started with. This was about choosing something new, something that came with risk she had not agreed to before. She looked at him carefully, searching for any sign of doubt, any hint that this was another calculated move. But there was none, just the same steady certainty that had carried him through everything else tonight. And slowly, almost without realizing it, she nodded, not as acceptance, not fully, but as acknowledgement that whatever this had become, it was no longer something either of them could pretend was simple, and for the first time, that did not feel like something to escape, it felt like something to face. Emily did not answer right away, not because she did not understand what he was offering, but because for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to actually feel it instead of analyzing it. The weight of his words settling somewhere deeper than logic, somewhere quieter, where decisions were not made out of survival, but out of choice, and that alone felt unfamiliar, almost dangerous in its honesty. She looked at him for a long moment, searching not for perfection, not for certainty, but for truth, and what she saw there did not look like a man trying to control an outcome. It looked like someone who had already given up that control the moment he chose her over the room behind them. The moment he chose her over what was easy, what was expected, what was safe. "You do not get to say something like that lightly," she said finally, her voice soft but steady, and Daniel did not try to. He did not downplay it, did not turn it into something easier to accept. "I am not," he replied, and that was what made the difference, not the words themselves, but the way he stood in them, without hesitation, without retreat, as if he understood exactly what they meant and had chosen them anyway. Emily exhaled slowly, her shoulders relaxing just enough to let the tension she had been holding all night finally loosen. Not completely, but enough to breathe through it. "This was supposed to protect me," she said, almost to herself. "A contract, a clean exit, no complications." Her eyes lifted back to his, clearer now, more certain in a different way. "But what you did in there, that was not protection." Daniel watched her closely, not interrupting, not correcting, just listening, and she could feel it, that he was not waiting for the right moment to respond. He was waiting for her to finish. "That was a choice," she continued, and there was no accusation in it, just recognition. And for the first time, that realization did not feel like something to resist. It felt like something to acknowledge. Daniel nodded slightly. "Yes," he said, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than anything else he could have added, because it meant he was not hiding behind anything anymore, not the deal, not the expectations, not the world he came from, just the fact that he had chosen differently. And that changed everything. Emily looked past him for a second, toward the city again, but this time it did not feel distant. It felt open, like something she could step into without already knowing the outcome. And when she looked back at him, there was a quiet shift in her expression, something softer, but stronger at the same time. "Then we do not go back to what this was," she said. Not as a question, not as a condition, but as a statement, and Daniel met her gaze without hesitation. "No," he answered, just as simply. And in that moment, there was no contract, no roles, no expectations written on paper, just two people standing in the space between what had been and what could be. And for the first time, Emily did not feel like she was trying to survive it. She felt like she was choosing it, slowly, carefully, but willingly. She took a small step forward, closing the last bit of distance between them. Not dramatic, not rushed, just enough to show that she was not stepping away anymore. And Daniel did not move, did not reach for her. He simply stayed where he was, letting her decide, letting her define the moment in her own time. And when she stopped in front of him, her voice quieter now, but clearer than ever, she said, "Then do not treat me like something temporary." And it was not a demand, not a test, just the truth of what she needed if this was going to be real. Daniel's answer came without delay, without hesitation. "I will not." And there was nothing uncertain in it, nothing left unresolved, just a promise made in the same quiet way everything else had been decided. Tonight, not loudly, not for the world, but in a way that mattered far more. And as the city lights flickered around them and the noise of the night carried on without them, something settled into place between them, not perfect, not finished, but real, and for the first time, that was enough.